Welcome to the Triage Method Podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell, recording live from Dublin, Sandyford.
Castledale, Dublin.
They only give Paddy's specific address there. So what are we talking about?
Well, this is the Q&A episode, and we got a question from Dean, I believe.
Dean.
In the group. And he was wondering about returning to activity post-lockdown in the context of managing his stress, his nutrition, his life, and more specifically, training and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So effectively, we're just going to answer this question probably really quickly, to be honest.
Probably.
Because while obviously it is a extremely complex system that we have to manage, because there's so many things that integrate into it, so many inputs, so many like stress, sources, different things you could do. Like we literally write articles on all of this stuff all of the time. But I know Dean is an avid reader, so he's probably read all of our content.
Of course.
And he's more so just looking for a generalized framework in terms of, maybe how should he plan his days, how should he organize his days, is there anything that he should be, focusing on in the context of, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training and obviously life stressors overall. So what are you thinking, Gary? Like, if you're in this situation, you're coming back to training, everything's getting back in, most clubs are opening up, most gyms are opening up, or they have already opened up. Like I've been training away for the last 2 weeks now, it feels. Have we been open in 2 weeks?
Yeah.
So I've been training away for the last 2 weeks. You've been training away for the last 2 weeks as well. So a lot of people are getting back into the swing of things. But how would you conceptualize this? Because obviously stuff like this happens all the time. People get injured and they want to come back to training, or they were away on holidays somewhere for a month, traveling or something, or maybe work was just extraordinarily busy for a while. They just couldn't get to the gym, couldn't get to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, couldn't do anything. So how do we think about this stuff?
Yeah, so I think one of the things Dean was getting at in the question is this kind of concept of balancing different stressors. And one of the ways I like to conceptualize this is the difference between or the difference and the comparison between specific and general stressors. So when we start to think about, as Dean said, life stress and the stress coming from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training, and the stress coming from standard resistance training, we can see that they all are going to have general features. So anytime you look at a stress response, whether it be an emotional stress response, a physical stress response, different types of training, life stress, financial stress, etc., there are always going to be common features between those things, but then they obviously have more specific things related to them. So when you're looking at the kind of general things, like obviously you're going to be thinking about general neurohormonal kind of factors related to stress. So things like, the sympathetic nervous system, that's going to be a little bit more active, that you're going to have being more of a kind of a fight or flight or a stress state, the more stressors you have, regardless of what those stressors are. So effectively, if you have someone who has a very low baseline level of life stress and they're engaging in some sort of training, then the training is giving them that kind of spike in stress, where let's say they have that sympathetic, that fight or flight response, but they have it briefly, and they're able to recover their physiology to a baseline again very readily, because basically the other systems at play are geared more towards recovery and recovering your physiology back to baseline. However, if you're someone who has constant stressors, so you have, let's say, jiu-jitsu in the morning, and then you go to college and you've got that stress, and then you've got other stressors in your life like financial stress, and then you go and do resistance training in the evening, and then you're also not sleeping, then you've basically you've got those little spikes in stress, but your overall baseline is elevated as it is, so it's more difficult for you to be able to bring your physiology back to baseline. So what you can see there is that there's kind of a general concept of stress, and then there are specific stressors that are layered on top of that, and we need to know how to kind of manage those. And one of the things that's specific to this question is that we're returning after a period of detraining. So that adds an additional layer of complexity here, because we basically have to understand that your ability to return your physiology to baseline is going to depend on how much of a perturbation there is. So if you are not currently as adapted to a given training stressor or a life stressor, then you're going to get more of perturbation in your physiology than someone who's used to it. So an example would be, for example, someone who is going back to training. They were previously doing 5 sets of 5 on squats consistently. They were very used to it. It wasn't much of a stressor. Going into the workout, they were like, yeah, cool, gonna do this, that's fine. They did the workout, they weren't sore the next day, that was just normal. Whereas now, they've got anxiety leading into the session because they know it's going to be challenging. They push themselves, the weights are down, it's really, really difficult, and then they're really sore afterwards. So there's an overall huge perturbation there, and it's more difficult to bring their physiology back to baseline. And the same thing applies then to things like life stressors, for example. Let's say you're a surgical intern, okay, so you're doing some sort of surgical task. If you're a surgeon, for the first time you've ever done it, it's the first time you've been given a bit of responsibility, you're so stressed, it's anxiety inducing, even though you're doing potentially the same task as someone who's been a surgeon for 5 years, whereas for them it's like, this is routine, this does not cause my heart rate to elevate loads, I don't feel like I'm profusely sweating, whereas the surgical intern is going to be, and that applies to any job. So effectively, we have to consider that element of tolerance here. So with all that in mind, we have a situation in which Dean and me and Paddy are returning to our kind of normal training environment that's layered on top of life stressors, of course. But basically, we're going to have lower levels of tolerance for the stressors we're going to be exposing ourselves to. And as a result, that brings us to thinking about how can we start to solve these problems. And the way I start to think about that, and the way I have programmed this for many clients as they've returned to the gym, is starting pretty much with just lower levels of volume, lower levels of intensity, staying further from failure, especially when we're thinking about a resistance training context. And then if you're thinking about the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training context, I don't know about you, but for me, returning to Jiu-Jitsu, like most of our coaches have been like, look lads, you're just coming back, get used to it. When you're going rolling, don't absolutely try and destroy your opponent. Just enjoy your training, get the body used to it. Of course, it doesn't tend to happen because once you get into a roll, everyone gets going and everyone gets excited. But you ultimately have potential to control that as well. So if you, Dean, or anyone else listening, you're returning to Jiu-Jitsu or you're returning to any other sport that you do, recognize that you still have some element of flexibility even when you're being coached by someone else, that you can pull back a little if you need to, that if there's 3 rolls going on, you're doing 3 rounds of 5 minutes, and the coach says, sit one out if you need to, if you're feeling particularly fatigued. If you know that you're feeling particularly fatigued, then take that option, use it to your advantage. And they're the ways I would be thinking about this in terms of starting to modify your overall training schedule. What do you think?
Like the whole thing, I basically am just looking at this as like resilience building,
pretty much.
Like it's like you already had the resilience to tolerate these stressors beforehand. I'm assuming you were doing resistance training previously and doing some Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and life stress and all that kind of stuff previously. Like obviously if you're just doing this for the first time, the advice still applies, but I'm presuming in this case that you're like, I'm coming to this having done this before the lockdown and I just want to get back into it. Well, what should I be thinking about? And effectively you just think of it as like, I used to be resilient to these stressors. I'm not resilient now. So I just have to rebuild that resilience. So how do you do that? It's like you learn to crawl before you learn to walk. So you go, I can definitely modify my resistance training, right? You can't really modify your life stress.
No.
Maybe to an extent you can, like there's a little bit of give and play there. Like, you don't have to sweat the little things as much. Like you can, play around with some of the stress management techniques and whatever. But that's kind of non-modifiable. So that's parked. Can't really do much, right? So we keep that in mind when we're looking at all the other stuff. But we're like, I can't just go, I need to make more money overnight, and it just happens. Nothing happens like that. Like, my mother dying of cancer, she's just going to stop because I'm actually just want to get back to training, So you can't get all these life stressors. You're like that they're compartmentalized. You keep your eye to them, but not a huge amount you can do. However, you have full control over your resistance training.
Yep. 100%.
Yeah. So you can literally be going into the gym and be like, normally I do 20 sets during this workout. You could literally do 5. You have full control. There's no one saying it, gun to your head, being like, you must do this. So you have full control over that. With the sporting side of things, even with the like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or like GAA and stuff, like I've been coaching a load of GAA athletes, and it's like they literally just in it full bore, and you can kind of be in a position, especially with team sports, where like if you're not ready for full bore, let's go at it, you lose your place on the team, and you're just like, all right, well, what do I do now? Like that was what I wanted, or not losing your place in the team. I wanted to be on the team, so I have to kind of give it my all. And if that's the case, like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a little bit easier to modify because you can just sit out a roll. You'd be like, I'm not feeling this one. It's not like a team sport where you're like, you can't sit out the 90-minute game. I just take 5-minute break, lads. Like you can't really do that. So with certain sports you can, certain sports you can't modify what you're actually doing on the day. So if that's the case and you're in a sport that you just can't modify it, like obviously we're talking about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu here, you can modify it, we'll come back to that. But if you're in something like GA and you can't modify it, then you have to be more in control of the fatigue that's being generated by your resistance training. So you have to be more cautious in terms of how much volume you're doing, how much intensity, how much frequency, all of those other variables. It's like, if you don't have control over here, like we don't have control over the life stress, and now we're saying we don't have control over the sporting stress, so we have to really manage the thing that we do have control over, and get that to the lower tolerable level, and then slowly start bringing that up to where we want to be with it. In the case of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, obviously you do have a little bit more control over how much you actually do in a class. Like you're just like doing technique work or whatever. You can take it a little bit handier rather than doing like, let's get straight into the next one, and literally doing 30 whatever goes of that technique. You can be like, I'm just gonna take it handy and do 5 tonight. I'm just gonna really work on having crisp technique rather than just like getting a lot of it done. So you can manage the overall fatigue of the session a little bit more with certain techniques in certain classes in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Obviously the rolls, like it's a little bit harder because you kind of want to get after it. But you can still be smart with that and be like, right, I'm going to get after it for we've 5 rounds and I'm going to get after it for 2 of them, and then the other 3 I'm just going to say to the other lad that I'm just taking it handy tonight, carrying an injury. If you have to tell them like that, if you don't want to lose face or whatever, you're like, my rib is at me, or my shoulder's at me, we just have a flow roll, like that is an option there. You're just like, do a little bit of a flow roll where it's not really like balls to the wall, it's just taking it handier. Your heart rate's not fucking skyrocketing. It's still a stressor, but it's a more manageable stressor in the context of what we're dealing with overall, right? And I don't know about you, Gary, but I'm actually a bit more of a fan of having more days off in the week as we build tolerance, right?
Yeah.
Rather than having the case where we're doing something every single day, where it's like, like you have to be on top of your training every single day. You have to be doing something. You have to be doing your cardio. You have to be doing your resistance training, especially because Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, there's a lot of qualities that we could be building towards or building to get better at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and that's not even to say like all of the actual Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that we need to do to get better at the technique of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, So you can be in a situation where you're kind of like, I need to train every single day. I need to be doing something. But I'm much more of a fan of like stacking things together in the week so that we have more days off in the week overall. So like in my context, in my case even, like I'm doing 4 Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu sessions and I'm doing 4 resistance training sessions, right? And I just do them on the same days. So that means I have 3 full days off per week. Now I'm still active in the a normal sense of the world of the word, in terms of the days that I'm off. I'm still getting like 10,000 steps. I'm still generally active. I'm not sedentary the whole day. So obviously you have to factor that in as well. But those days I'm pretty much just taking off. I'm like, let's just relax, just let the body recover. Any little dings I've picked up in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I'm just like, just letting the body recover. We're not absolutely hammering it. There's not a fight coming up. There's nothing, I need to be like pushed through the pain, push through everything. Like it's not there, right? So I don't need to overall push too hard. And with the resistance training, I'm like, I want to do 3 sets of this exercise, but I'm still kind of getting back into it. So I'm not going to be overly pushed if I said I want to do 3 sets of 12 and like I'm on my second set, I'm like, that last, like I wanted to keep like a rep or 2 in reserve for that set, or for all 3 sets, and that last one was like a little bit too close to failure. Like I'm not worried right now. I'm like, all right, I'm just going to do 2 sets, and the next time I come in I'll do the same weight and I'll do 3 sets. Like I'm building slower than I would if I was like, I'm in this the role of training. I'm in the full rhythm of it, where I'm like, actually, I know I can push this 3 sets today. I'm just having a little bit of an off day, but mentally I'm like, I actually know I can recover from this. I know that I have the capability of this, and in the grand scheme of things, I know where to put the foot on the pedal, like put the foot on the gas and like push through, and where to ease back. And this is a case right now where it's like, let's just ease back. We're just going to the lowest effective dose. We're just slowly building from there, and then as we're back into it, like I'm basically treating this as it's going to take you about 8 weeks to fully get back the adaptations that we want. Like, you can say you get them back in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks maybe, but I'm kind of just like, I'm not in a rush. 8 weeks, 2 months, like that's kind of bringing you back into August-ish time, from the lockdown. So I'm like, that's when everything is supposedly opening back up again. Everyone's back into a more normal rhythm. Supposedly schools and stuff are open in September, so it's back to real life. So you're basically using this as a slight ramp up period back to real life come August, September, so that's how I'm kind of conceptualizing it. I'm like, it's just 8 weeks of taking it a little bit handier and just slowly building resilience and just doing all the same things that you would do in any other context. Just manage like fatigue, manage stress, get good sleep, make sure your nutrition is on point. Like, it's not, that's what I'm saying at the start, it's not an overly hard discussion to have. It's still the same things that you have to do all the time, and all you're really changing right now is take it a little bit slower. I've been off for a couple of months. I want to do 3 sets. I'm just gonna do 1. It's fine.
And the only other thing is just remembering as well to keep your goal as your goal. So keep the goal the goal. It doesn't mean that everyone has to have a goal, because if you're just training for general health and that's literally it, then ultimately it's kind of just not that important. It's just like you need to be doing some sort of training consistently for decades, and that's really what's important. But if you have a specific goal, like if you're someone like Dean now and you're saying, right, I'm doing jiu-jitsu, I'm doing resistance training, and there's specific goals associated with those things, remember that what that goal is, because the goal is not just to train hard. That's part of the process, but ultimately you getting to your goal of, let's say, building your squat back up to 120 for 5, then that involves you going through the steps of gradually increasing your training volume again up to your previous levels, rather than doing the previous levels, okay? Because I think sometimes we get so attached to specific workouts and specific ways of training that we forget the purpose that they're there for. And if we're now at a lower level than we were previously at, then we simply don't need the same stimulus to be able to get back to the level that we were at, because we're building up to that point by definition. So don't attach yourself to your workouts. Don't attach yourselves to solely like, oh, this needs to be the hardest workout, I need to be training harder than everyone else. Rather, make it your goal to progress in the direction of your goal, and that's ultimately what leads to progress. You don't want to just be the person who's solely taking pride in the fact that you do 5 sets of 12 when you could be getting benefits from 2 sets of 12. Reap those rewards while they're there. So rather than heading back into the gym and trying to do your previous program immediately out of the gate, I would at least take this first 4-week block as a block of an introduction. Let's build back up to baseline. That's what I'm doing with the vast majority of my clients. As we said in the podcast that was dedicated to the return to training post-lockdown, I'm starting most people back on 60 to 70% of their previous volume that they were doing, and then building them gradually back up. And even at that, you'll still find people are quite sore after their workouts. You'll still find that strength will be down and that you'll be fatigued during the session. And that is completely normal. You haven't been doing what you've been doing all along. And for some people, I know that this will be the longest break they've had from the gym in potentially 10 years even, because genuinely people don't take that much time off the gym, especially if they take it seriously. So yeah, I don't really have much else to say there. Just remember that your tolerance is going to be lower. So as a result, you need to build back up to that. You also need to weigh up the different stressors that are in your life, and you need to try and balance those. You need to some degree prioritize. So if you're doing resistance training and you're doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is more important? Have a think about that. Is one way more important than the other? And if so, then maybe you want to prioritize getting back to baseline on one quicker. They're all things that you can think about yourself, and that ultimately we can't decide for you. So yeah,
because that does really help as well. Just actually having a little bit of a think of like, what's the most important thing for me? Because like maybe you do come into a day where you're supposed to be doing a double day session, like I suggested, and you're like, well, I'm feeling like shit. And you're like, I need to not do one of those workouts. Like if you're like, I actually care more about the resistance training, then obviously you skip the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, right? Whereas if you care more about the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, then you're like, I either do the absolute bare minimum. I go to the gym and I literally do my 1 set and I'm done, and you focus on your Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or again you just don't do the resistance training session, so I think that does really help. And like that across the board, like that helps, you know. In terms of like you could be doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or any other sport for 20 years, and you're like, you know what? Actually, my resistance training is more important to me. You know, I do the sport for the community aspect, and like just enjoy the sport, rather than like it's like, oh, I really want to progress this, you know. Whereas you're like, I actually really like progressing in the gym, or I really like building my physique or my strength, or you know, I like the health benefits I get from resistance training that I don't seem to get from this sport or whatever, you know. So just having a think and going, where is my spectrum, my continuum of like what's the most important thing to me, and then making your choices with that guiding your choices, you know. But yeah, I have nothing else to say with that. It's pretty straightforward. Obviously in theory I say it's pretty straightforward. In practice like it's a little bit harder because you got a little bit of dings here, a bit of pain here, or you're just pushed too hard in training. It can be hard in the moment where you're like, I'm feeling fucking great, and then it's like, alright, well the next day I feel like shit, or the evening when you're supposed to be training again you feel like shit, or you know, there's all that stuff that has to be taken into account. But yeah, I'm just like, treat it as if you're building resilience.
Yep.
You're not as resilient right now, just slowly bring it back up to the level of resilience that you want to be at. It'll get there in time. Again, I'm just like, it's gonna take about 8 weeks for me, and that's where I'm kind of like with my clients. I'm like, it just takes time to get back into it. Now some of them have obviously been training away the whole time. Like some of them have had literally just access to gyms or have their own home gym and stuff. And even in that case, I'm like, all right, well, I was thinking in my head it's 8 weeks to come back. I'm like, I'm giving you 2, 3, 4 weeks to be fully back into the rhythm of, you know, going to the gym and doing your sport or whatever, you know. But even in that case, I'm like, we're still just building resilience. That's all we're trying to do. We want to be resilient to the stressors that we're encountering in the world, whether it's, you know, life stress, lack of sleep stress, emotional stress, financial stress, all those other things, or we're talking about training stress or sports stress or nutrition stress or whatever. It's like we can build a level of tolerance to these stressors, and right now our tolerance is probably a little bit lower, so all we're trying to do is just build that back up. And how do you build it back up? Slow and steady.
Yes, sir. That's it.
Nothing else to say.
Nothing else to say. So yeah, guys, as always, if you're interested in following along with our work, then it would be wise to join the Triage Method newsletter. You can subscribe to that below, and that's where we'll send you recommended resources from around the internet, along with the content that we've published. You can also follow that content in the Triage Method community, where we also post additional posts, and there's discussions in there that you won't see featured on our social media otherwise, so it will be recommended that you join that. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, subscribe to the podcast, leave a review on the podcast would be great. We do have online coaching spaces available, so if you are interested in online coaching, especially as you return to the gym now, then that is something that we are offering. So if you'd like to work with myself or Paddy, then we do have spaces available for that service. And if you want to follow us on the old social medias, we're primarily active on Instagram and Facebook, although Facebook community is better, and YouTube. If you're interested in actually watching videos that again won't be available on other platforms, then YouTube would be a wise thing to get involved with.
And if you just don't like being on all these social media platforms, just join the newsletter.
That's it.
Then you can just be like, right, I just pick and choose what I want to see. Everything goes in the newsletter, or everything goes in the Facebook community. So it's like, join either of those and you'll get what you need to get.
Yep.
Pretty straightforward. Anyway, I have nothing else to say, guys. It is quite literally too easy.